evening and welcome to another edition of Down to the Wire. I'm your host, dermatologist, and joining me again this weekend is Capping with Candice, Candice here. Candice, an exciting Preakness Stakes last Saturday and overall a pretty formful race with California Chrome coming out on top.
Yes, I mean, we can't ask for much more, having a Triple Crown alive now with California Chrome, who of course won the Derby, winning the as well. I thought, he was definitely much the best in that race. There isn't much to say about anyone else as far as I don't think there was any kind of sort of trip troubles or some sort that, would have resulted in a different winner. I think he was clearly the class of that field. What I can say is I think that, while this is a fantastic story, and I think, all of us would be happy if he won at Belmont. I think this is kind of the point where we have to separate the story from what we saw in the race. And I do think in the Preakness he had to work harder than he's had to work in any of his recent wins. Social inclusion came at him pretty early coming into the far turn, and then he had to fend off Red on Curlin late, and that resulted in him putting in a pretty long, extended drive to the finish line, and it was enough to get it done in that race. But, we're going to be talking about 3 races in 5 weeks here, so those are all the things we're going to have to take into consideration when we get closer and end up handicapping the Belmont. Aside from him, what I can say is, kudos to Red on Curlin, who finished second. He seems to always find a way to get in the mix. He's very consistent, so, that was a nice performance from him there. In the same hand, social inclusion, I don't think he disgraced himself at all. He was very, very worked up before that race, totally washed out, just completely lathered. And I thought he, dug in pretty gamely late to hang on and get third there. And maybe lastly, what I want to say is, we hear all the talk about California Chrome, and I think far too often the jockeys aren't mentioned. And Victor Espinoza has, turned night and day on California Chrome. I think that, those two are really a perfect team together, and he was incredibly aggressive early on in the Preakness, but in doing so, he not only established position for his horse, but he also kind of, put maybe who was his biggest opponent in social inclusion in an unfavorable position. And I think, that was really nice to see. I think so often we see jockeys who, they aren't so aggressive, they're kind of passive out of the gate, and then they kind of maybe complain afterwards. And it's really nice to see a jockey, put his horse in the right spot and, just let him do the rest. And that's the kind of horse that California Chrome is. He has that fantastic turn of foot that if you can just get him in the proper position early, he's really, really tough to beat.
Yeah, I was impressed with just the race. I think a sign of a good horse is when they just keep on putting out the same type of effort, and he's now won 6 in a row, and there's not one time in any one of those 6 races where I didn't think he was the best horse, and I think that speaks volumes. And then I also think that I was kind of glad that he did kind of get tested a couple of times, because the last 3 or 4 races he kind of made it look so easy. It made you kind of wonder if what he was doing out there was, if you're really seeing what you thought you saw. And the fact that social inclusion made that move, and then he kind of just swatted him away, and then Ride on Curlin really put a beeline on him, put his nose down, and he kind of, still fended off that challenge. It kind of made him look a little bit more human. Sometimes, when you see a horse tested, he really hadn't been tested a couple of times. So I actually have more respect for him now, just because he's won 6 in a row. He's won 3 straight Grade 1s, and in all 6 races after the race, I just felt like he was the best horse. So to me, that's a sign, the ultimate sign of a good horse. It's kind of like when Bulls were winning championships every year, and when New England went 16-0, and it's like the good teams and the good horses make it look easy, and that's a good thing. Like, if you've got too many excuses, then you kind of start to wonder. So I was impressed with his race, and I just think I think people like closers, but, like I was telling you one time, like, a horse like Lost Code, he won 8 in a row on the wire to wire. Like, now his races would just be, really torn apart because, he had good trips. Well, I mean, when you go wire to wire, you're going to have a good trip. So I just think Chrome puts himself in a position to win, and he opens up. And I agree, a lot of times we only criticize the jockeys when they make mistakes. And Victor, again, he hasn't made a mistake in 6 races, or either that or California Chrome is just that good. So I think it was a good performance. And it looks like we'll have a full field for the Belmont even.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add with California Chrome too, I think that's really impressed me, is this is now 2 races in a row. In the Derby, it was him and Samrot, and then here in the Preakness, it was him and Social Inclusion, where he's had a horse, you know, really taking it to him coming through the far turn, kind of, you know, stride for stride, and he just puts them away in a fashion that I've never seen. I don't know if you ever have, but it's almost like it's demoralizing to them, and I've just never seen that before, and it's, you know, it kind of takes your breath away a little bit.
This week we decided to kind of take a different approach and go across the country and try to pick out some different races to handicap. First one is at Hollywood Park, Santa Anita, and it's actually on a Friday, and it's a 2-year-old race, and we both like to handicap those. I think for different reasons. We like the promise, and then also it kind of makes you kind of open up your handicapping notebook and look at some different things.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely love the 2-year-old races. They're some of the ones I look forward to the most every year. Like I said, I think you can throw a whole bunch of strategies at them, and maybe more so than the horses who have proven form lines. And this one at Santa Anita is pretty fun. We have 2 horses in here who've ran before, but we're early enough in the juvenile season that most of these are first-time starters. For me, the horse who stood out the most was GQ Grace. The work reports on him are just really good, and that's something I really take into consideration when it's a first-time starter, just because we've also never seen them before, so the clockers have, so that's what we have to go off of. His sire is Grace Upon Grace, who won in his debut, and his trainer, Walter Chalice, is also pretty good with first-time starts. He seems to do well with this type, so to me, that's kind of all the signs that I look for as far as, you know, a horse who maybe is going to be, you know, he'll be a little bit of a price in here, I think. So he's one that, you know, he doesn't have the fancy pedigree of some of the others, but there still seems to be promise that he can do well in his first start. You know, other ones that I would mention other than him are Tis Jolie. We've talked a few times, I think, on Twitter about Tis Wonderful, and he had a fantastic year last year as far as his juvenile crop, and they were just about, I mean, there was about 6 weeks last year where it seemed like they just couldn't even lose. Tis Jolie has run before. I saw his previous race at Santa Anita. It just almost looked like he needed the prep and needed the run, but his wonderful juveniles are good enough that I'd be willing to give him another chance here. And the last one who I think is worth mentioning, I don't really love him in this race, but Social Request is by Looking at Lucky, who is pretty, you know, popular sire. This is his first crop this year. I think he just got his first winner in the last week or 2. So he's a popular sire. I know has a lot of fans, and his owner is Ronto Racing Stable, who of course owns Social Inclusion. So a few kind of storylines going into that horse.
When I handicap this race, I kind of like to look at different angles that maybe not everybody looks at. And one of the angles I like to look at is I go through all the sires, and then I go through all the mares, and I kind of try to identify the precocious, speedy ones. And if a sire won in his first 2 lifetime starts, or if the mare won in his first 2 lifetime starts, I kind of note that as a speedy influence. And 2-6 Wins is the horse that I'm looking at here. Midshipman is the sire. It's his first crop of foals, and he had 8 starts and 5 wins, including he won a Breeders' Cup Juvenile race. And the mare on this one was 3 for 9, so 9 lifetime starts, 3 wins, and broke her maiden at Churchill Downs in her 2nd lifetime start. So you got a speedy influence on both sides. And then Michael Pender, he's trained some horses in the past that have kind of surprised at good odds. And this horse has a 4 furlong nice workout and a couple of 3 furlong workouts, and a nice workout out of the gate. So I think he's kind of interesting. Also, Tis Jolie just was interesting. The mare on this horse had 78 starts, 16 wins, and 139,000 in earnings. So it's 4.5 furlongs, and sometimes you can see some precocious horses, and it should be interesting, I think. Now we go to Calder, and this race kind of came up kind of a group of salty older horses.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about this one. There's a lot of horses in here who, you know, we've seen them many times, and we kind of know about them all. one interesting one in here is Shaba, who we've talked about a few times. Is the kitten who loves the dirt, and he's a stakes winner over dirt, so he's going to be interesting in here. I see a lot of speed in this race, though, so it kind of pointed me towards two horses. One of those is Flatter This. He's a closer, so he should, the speed in this race should definitely help him out. This is a bit of a stakes class jump for him into this type of stakes race against this kind of a field. But he has a couple races this year where, against lesser company, of course, but he finished second in a few races earlier this year where he was running against the bias locally. So that kind of caught my attention, made me think that perhaps those runs were a little bit better than it just, looks on paper at first hand. In his last run, which was also locally over a mile, he finished fifth. He was a ways back, 10 lengths back. He broke slowly in that race. Shaba was also in there. He finished third, but I think he's one who, at least in that race, he seemed to be doing his best running late. So he's one who I think, might really appreciate just the slight step up in distance that he's going to get here. And like I said, he seems to do well locally, and his running style should definitely be flattered by the pace scenario that he's going to come up against here. The other horse who stood out to me was Narvaez. I think he's ran against tougher than these, so I think he's going to appreciate, going against this group instead of Palace Malice and Falling Sky and that lot. He also comes from off the pace, so again, those are the ones I'm kind of focusing on because I do think it's going to be, a healthy pace up front. If anything, this might be a touch too far for Narvaez, but he's classy enough that I think he could hit the board anyway. So for me, Flatter This is the horse who I'm looking at for the win. I do like Narvaez, but if you're playing, your multi-race wagers, I think, a horse like Shaba is one who maybe you need to consider as well. Even though he's a little off form, he's shown enough class in the past that it'd be hard to kind of leave him off your ticket.
Yeah, what's interesting about this race is a lot of the horses seem to run best on the lead. Saba's one of those horses that when he does run well, he seems to be on the pace or near the lead. Dad's Laugh had a big win the last time, and now he stretches out off the sprint victory. I kind of came up with Narvaez. As you mentioned, it looked like he's 1 for 2 at Calder, and he's faced some really good running lines. And what I noticed, it seems like with a lot of these horses, they really are pretty formful. It's just depending on pace and distance and how the different race shapes up is kind of when they run first or second or when they run fourth or fifth. And I just kind of think Narvaez is kind of rounding back into another good form cycle. And then I like the way Sir Quisqueyano comes into this race. Another one that's, faced a lot of good horses. And now he comes in with a good record at Calder, 8 for 10 in the money. And then he comes off a couple of Gulfstream races. So, again, he's another one that he's run good races on the front end, so I'd call him more of an early type of horse. But he does have a couple of races where he's pressed the pace. And I think I'm anticipating about 113, maybe 113 and 2 for 6 furlongs. And so I think Dad's Laugh, or if anybody gets a uncontested lead, I think they'll run further than we think. But I'm kind of assuming a little bit of a contested pace, and maybe Narvaez or somebody else can lay off that pace and kind of make a run approaching the turn.
Yeah, I definitely expect Dad's Laugh to be up front. I think maybe General Shimama will be up front. Shaba has blinkers on, I believe, so even though he's one who tends to be forwardly placed, he might take, even a little bit more of a step forward early on, with that being that new equipment change. I do see where you get Senior Quisqueyano from. His last race he ran against It's My Lucky Day, finished second there, which is, that's a nice run. It's, It's My Lucky Day was, very good 3-year-old, and for me, I think you have to kind of look in his form. I expect him to lay off the pace a little bit. He'll be forwardly placed, but I don't expect him to be on the lead. I think, as we're going to see going through the year, I think we really have to take some of the Gulfstream races from a pace standpoint with a grain of salt. Because I think a horse like him, and we've seen that be the case with others, that, they were kind of run more forwardly than would be typical of them, on purpose, just because of how that track was playing. So, I can see why you like him, because I do expect him to be forwardly placed, but maybe a little bit off the lead.
For me, one of the wagering strategies for a tough older race like this is, this is really where you can play some daily doubles, play some horses in exactas up and down, because you can get 4-to-1, 5-to-1. There's really not like a 4-to-5 type shot in a race like this. Another horse that I just want to mention, just because he's ran a lot, and I think people think that he goes in and out of form, but I think his speed figures are pretty consistent. But if he gets a pace to run at, Joshua's Compromise is one of those horses that every once in a while he gets a better effort, and it's more because of pace and the way the race shapes up for him. And I think this time maybe there is a hot pace, and Joshua's Compromise can pick up the pieces a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he kind of reminds me a little bit of the older version of Commissioner, that he always kind of runs his race, but a lot of times maybe it's not quite fast enough. He'll finish 4th or 5th here. But if he gets a hot pace to run at, that's definitely going to help him out. One thing to know with him, though, and I think it's the case with Speak Logistics is in here too, both of them have kind of a streak of having trouble out of the gate or breaking slowly. So if you're going to wager both of them, bear in mind that they both kind of have that tendency.
So overall, I'm anticipating a contested pace, and I think there's a chance for a price either first or second. Now we go to Arlington and a turf course race, and of course Arlington's got a nice turf course, and we got a bunch of 3-year-olds here and a couple of 3-year-olds going back to the turf.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this race. I mean, I don't know, I kind of like the turf races. Maybe I'm a little bit alone on that one. In this race, I also think that we're going to get a good pace here. Solitary Ranger, we saw him a few times on the Kentucky Derby Trail, and he's a pretty headstrong guy. He'll be up front, and I expect maybe Istim Ford to be up there with him. If anyone goes up there with him, then it's going to be good up front, because Solitary Ranger's headstrong. He wants that lead, and he'll kind of fight for it a little bit. But for me, I kind of focus on 2 horses in here who exit the same race. I think that race on the undercard at Churchill Downs, won by Global View, was a pretty strong race. The top 3 in there, Global View, Storming Into, and Quotient, we saw all of them come from Florida, from the turf division down there, and I really do think that's where the strength of this division is at. So I think this race at Churchill might turn out to be kind of a key race. I ultimately sided with Long on Value, who finished 4th in there. It was his turf debut. He didn't have the easiest of trips. He had to go pretty wide at one point, and he was a little bit rank at times, but I do think that, he showed that he took to the turf. He ran a pretty nice speed figure there according to time form, and like I said, he's not going to face, this is a nice field, but it's nowhere near the depth of that field, in my opinion. So I think he's going to get, a little bit of a relief here coming against these horses. So Long on Value, I expect to, improve second time on the turf and against maybe a little bit lesser company, and he would be my top choice here. The only other horse I would consider here really is Chief Barker. If you read my blog or follow me on Twitter, I talked about him quite a bit going into that race at Churchill. That was his American debut, and I knew him from over in England. He was a really nice horse over there as a juvenile. If you remember Crescelium, who won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf, her only loss came to Chief Barker. He is a horse who, tends to take to the firm turf, and just in that race at Churchill, he looked incredibly flat. I've never seen him run like that before. He was coming off quite a long layoff. I don't think he had ran since October, so perhaps he needed the run. He's Lasix off here, though, as well, so maybe there was an issue with that. I definitely expect him to improve, just because I've never seen him like that, so I'm willing to forgive him for that one effort and see what he does here, because he was a very classy juvenile. He had won 3 of 4 overseas. So for me, Long on Value is my top choice, but I would definitely include Chief Barker. I think, I can forgive him for one effort and see how he does here.
For me, I wanted to talk about a couple of horses that are in my stable mail before I actually get into my selections. One of them is Rankhaspriviledges. And this horse I put on my stable mail because he won first out at Keeneland last fall, and then kind of got shipped around a couple of times, ran in Delta, in the jackpot, and the cash call. And then I noticed he wasn't nominated to the Triple Crown and didn't start working out until later on in actually March. So I think something went wrong, that they knew he was going to be out for at least 3-4 months, so they didn't even pay the nomination fee. But I do think this is a horse that definitely, this is kind of a prep race. And then I do think he's bred to run long, and he's also bred ultimately to be a good turf horse. Another horse that I think that some people might just throw out is an Illinois bred, and I wanted to mention this Afortable. The mare on this horse was a multiple stakes winner and has already produced 5 stakes winners. So this isn't your average Illinois bred. It popped last time at 20-1 at Keeneland. It broke its maiden at 4-1. I think people have already underestimated this horse a couple of times. And people that follow the Midwest circuit know that Chris Block is one of the perennial leading trainers at Arlington, and he wins open company races at Gulfstream every year with Illinois breds. So I think this horse is live, and it has a shot in this race. I do like Rise the Man. For some reason, I just think that, Neil Pessin does a good job, another good Arlington conditioner. He's a good turf trainer, and this horse has kind of some good, sneaky, long pedigree breeding on him, and I think his races are competitive again at the fairgrounds. A lot of times people don't realize, that fairgrounds turf course, if you've ever watched races there consistently, some days it just looks like a sand pit that's kind of painted green. And I think this is a horse that when you actually get on a real turf course, what's lush and green, a lot of times even though horses quote unquote ran on the turf at the fairgrounds, when they actually go to Belmont or Keeneland or Arlington, I kind of pretend like they're first time turf starters if it looks like they're really bred for the turf. So it's kind of just one of those hidden angles that I play, and you really can't quantify it. You just have to think, well, maybe that turf course is kind of more of a sand pit. So Rise the Man is kind of one of those sneaky long shots, and it's got a good turf jockey, so I think he's kind of playable in a race like this.
Another one that I wanted to mention, I think she might be a little bit pace compromised here if she tries to go at it with Solitary Ranger, but It's Tim Ford is the one filly in this race with the boys, and if you look through her past performances, I mean, she ran some really nice races. She was second to Testa Rossi down in Tampa. That was a really nice effort, a pretty fast race, and she just kind of gave up to a nice horse in Testa Rossi late. She lost to a little bit sassy at Churchill last time out. I mean, this is clearly her distance, and if you look through her past performances, she's hit every other race because every other race she's around the turf. So really, every time that she's around the turf, she's fired and been up there. Like I said, I think she might be a little bit pace compromised here, but she is a nice filly to look for, going forward, even if maybe, she fades a little bit late here.
What about long on value? I think this horse is going to get bet pretty hard just because of the connections, Mott, and kind of has a little bit more of a speedy dirt pedigree, but I don't know, his last race he kind of stretched out and ran evenly on the turf.
For me, he's my number one choice here. Like I said, last time out was his turf debut. He had ran on the dirt prior to that, and in some pretty nice races, to be honest. I mean, he finished 6th in the Champagne, and which doesn't look so bad now considering everybody who was in that field. And he finished 4th in the Hutchinson, but again, now we know Wildcat Red won that race, probably Wildcat Red's best race in his career to date. Pablo Del Monte finished 3rd there, who we just saw in the Preakness. So, even though, in his dirt races, you kind of have to, put his actual finishing positions aside a little bit, he was running in some pretty tough company, and I think he was a little bit battle-tested. And I quite liked his race last time out at Churchill. Like I said, I think that was a really, really salty field. In my heart, I really believe the strength of this division are those horses coming out of Florida, your Global View Storming Inti, Lubin, Mr. Speaker, that whole crew. So I think, that top 3 is straight from their Global View Storming Inti quotient, are all from Florida. So, he's not going to be facing those types here. He also had a little bit of a wide trip there. So I would definitely expect him to move forward off that effort second time on the grass.
One of the reasons why I like to play the turf races, especially at Arlington, is that you kind of get a mixture of horses. You get horses trying turf for the first time, and then you get some from Keeneland, Gulfstream, and from the fairgrounds. And that's usually how you get prices. When the same horses run at the same track at the same distance all the time, pretty soon you kind of know who's better than who. Is there any angles that you kind of like to play as you want, or anybody out of this race that you think that, well, maybe this Saturday isn't the day, but down the road they're going to maybe be a really good horse?
I mean, for me, I think everyone who follows me on Twitter kind of knows I tend to look for the European horses. I pay close attention to international racing, so I think I have a pretty good idea of the form over there. And while I was kind of shocked, to be honest, at Chief Barker's debut with how flat he ran, I'm thinking maybe second time off of a long layoff, Lasix off. Maybe him and Lasix didn't agree with each other. But he was far too talented of a juvenile for him to just completely flop over here, in my opinion. He was 3 out of 4 over there. He was running against nice horses over there. Like he beat Crescelian, he beat a couple nice handicap horses as well. So, for me, he was just too promising of a juvenile for him to just completely fall off the wayside. So, for me, it's Chief Barker, but this is kind of a make it or break it race for him. To me, with the Lasix off and with making now another start in the U.S., I expect him to run much better. And if he doesn't, well, then maybe it's not going to work out.
One thing I noticed about Chief Barker was over there he'd ran 4 races, twice on soft footing and then twice on good footing. Mm-hmm. And the Churchill race was actually his first race on what we call firm over here. Do you think that might have contributed to that performance or not really?
I mean, it might have. I know he broke slow in that race, and that might have taken him a little bit off guard, being so far behind. Because obviously we run our races much differently here than they do over there. And he definitely is, what you'd expect. He's a little bit of the plotter type, but he has a big kick late. So being so far behind, instead of in a pack, might have taken him off guard a little bit. So I think maybe that had a little more to do with it. His best runs were over faster ground overseas. So I don't think it was the ground. I think he wants firm ground. I think maybe coming off the layoff, and if there was something going on with him in the Lasix, and the bad start, and that was just a really salty group. You can't have that many things go wrong and expect a good finish out of a race like that.
Kind of a two-week break now between the Belmont, and this is kind of now we got to dive into the kind of find your spots at some of the different tracks, and I think this kind of gets to, in some ways you focus in on for 2-3 months on all the 3-year-olds, but now you kind of got to go track to track and find your turf courses and your angles, and this is really where you can build up a good stable of trip notes, and as those horses kind of ship around from track to track, you can try to get some prices, hopefully, if we can get the weather to cooperate and keep some of these turf races on the turf.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, this is kind of the time of the year where, I love leading up to the Triple Crown as well, but I kind of like delving into some of these races where, you're not always going to have an 8-5 or 9-5 favorite, but, a lot more competitive field, even if it isn't grade 1 or grade 2s. I think sometimes these are the races where there really is money to be had.
Well, next week we'll try to pick out a combination of some 2-year-old races from around the country, and then the week after that we come back and we'll have a full field, a nice Belmont card. That's going to do it for another edition of Down to the Wire. Thank you for joining us this week.